Etta Calder did not put her hand to the rail when the laughter went around the fence meeting at the county seat, though every man leaning back along that long table knew she had buried her father on the home rise 2 summers gone, and driven a day and a night of cut-off, fenced-in country to stand in that doorway and be laughed at. She had come to the fall meeting of the Chalk Flats Stock Association to say a plain thing out loud in front of witnesses, that she meant to hold her father's deeded home section and the open gap it guarded, the last gate out of the basin the Meridian Land and Cattle Company had not yet strung shut with its wire, and to answer in open court the fence-cutting complaint the company had sworn against her outfit, whatever it cost her, and she had gotten as far as the words "my gap" when the room decided it was the best joke it had heard since the long rail first rolled its wire across the free grass. She had 60 days to the fall term of court, a $1,200 note the company had quietly bought falling due the same week, and a felony charge of cutting a fence hanging over the head of an unwed girl who had never in her life cut a strand of another man's wire, and she stood in the doorway and let them laugh, and counted, slow, from 1, the way her father had taught her to count anything that frightened her, until her pulse came back down under her own hand. If this is your kind of country, take 1 quiet second to subscribe and ride along, because what an unwed girl and a horse the whole basin called a worthless blue outlaw did over the 60 days that followed, across a strung fence and a sworn lie, a fouled spring and a wall of grass fire driven onto her herd against another man's wire, is the kind of story the Chalk Flats told on itself for the next 40 years. And told wrong every time. The meeting was held in the long upper room of the Stockman's Hall at the county seat, because the Stockman's Hall had the only table in the country long enough to seat every outfit on the flats under one roof at once. And the smell of it was cold coffee and cigar smoke, and the particular dry dust of a range gone 3 months without a good rain. 24 men filled the chairs, the big outfits and the little ones, and the one banker who held paper on most of them. And Etta had come in the side door out of the heat in her good gray dress with her chin level, which the country had long ago decided was pride, and which was in fact only the discipline of a woman who had learned that if she let her face move at all, it would move all the way. She was 28 years old that summer. She was not a large woman. Her hands were a horseman's daughter's hands, brown and split at the knuckle, and there was no ring on any finger of either one, which the country had also long ago decided was a thing to be settled by her selling out and marrying, the sooner the better, before an unwed girl made a public fool of herself on a man's ground. Now, Miss Calder. That was Dorsey Pruitt, who chaired the meeting because his father had chaired it, a soft, heavy man who was not unkind and not much else either. Nobody here doubts your grit, Lord knows. But a horse outfit hemmed in on a fenced range in the worst dry spell this country's seen is a hard thing for a full crew of seasoned men to carry in a good year, and this has not shaped up a good year. There's no shame in a young woman letting the note be assumed and selling her stock for what it'll bring, and starting fresh somewhere. A girl's got people. The note is $1,200, and every man at this table knows who bought it, Etta said. Her voice was low, and it carried, because she had pitched it to carry over the ball of 100 head at a fall gather, and did not have to raise it now. And the gap the company wants off me is worth 10 times the note and the outfit both, because it is the one gate out of this basin that a man can trail a herd through to the cars, and whoever holds it holds every outfit on the Chalk Flats by the throat. Sell out, and I've handed the whole country's gate to the man who fenced me in to make me sell at a losing girl's figure, and thanked him for the favor. I can do the arithmetic on that difference, Mr. Pruitt, so can every man laughing. That quieted a corner of the room, because it was true, and because a stock town will forgive a woman almost anything faster than it will forgive her doing sums out loud. But it was into that particular little silence that Sewell Crane chose to rise up smooth out of his chair near the head of the table, and the room turned to him the way iron filings turn. Because Sewell Crane was the money of the Chalk Flats country, the way weather is a country, the largest thing in it, and the thing every smaller thing arranged itself around. He was a man of about 50 that year, and the country called him the Wire King, and he had earned the title the way such titles are earned, one fenced-off neighbor at a time, until the long rail and the eastern money behind it, the Meridian Land and Cattle Company that no man on the flats had ever laid eyes on, held the grass and the water and the paper on every outfit along Dry Willow. But the one Cole Calder had proved up years back, the home section on the rise, and the deeded quarter that closed a hand around Calder Gap, the one gate the company had not been able to fence or buy. Crane was not a cold, gray, reasonable man in the old way. He was worse, because he was a pleasant one. He was smooth and easy and modern, in a good town coat, with a smile he spent freely and eyes that never spent a thing, and he did not come at a neighbor with threats the way an older, cruder man would. He came at you with the future, with talk of improvement and rail rates and blooded stock and the tidy fenced country that was coming, whether a man liked it or no, and he let you understand, gently, that you were the past, and that the past did not need to be fought, only waited out. "I'll say a thing plainly," he told the room, "and Miss Calder may take it however she likes." He turned his easy face on her, and the smile stayed, which was the worst of him. "I stood at Cole Calder's grave the summer before last, hat in my hand, and I meant every word I said over it. Your father was a stockman this country will not see the like of again. But he ranged the old open way, past every fence, and the open way is what the fire caught him out on, and it is a plain kindness, not a cruelty, to tell an unwed girl the truth no one else at this table has the stomach to tell her, which is that the open country your father loved is gone under the wire. And it is not coming back, and a woman alone cannot hold a horse outfit against the whole tide of the age. I'll assume your note at the bank tomorrow morning. I'll pay you $800 cash for the outfit, the stock, and the deeded quarter, which is more than a forced sale would bring you in a dry fall, and you keep your saddle and your good name, and start your life over with money in your hand, instead of a lien on your neck. My people have drawn it fair." He looked around the table, gathering the nods he had grown there, like a crop. "That is a decent offer, and there is not a man here would call it otherwise." There was not. The room hummed its agreement, and the banker looked at Etta with the particular pity that is 3 parts relief it is not him. It was, laid out flat on that long table, the whole of Sewell Crane's genius he had offered, in front of 24 witnesses, to save her. And the price of being saved was the deeded quarter and the gap, which were the only 2 things on the Chalk Flats he had ever wanted, and without which the outfit was a fenced-in section of dry grass and a house. He would pay $800 and the balance of a note he had bought himself, and take the one gate of the basin, worth more than every steer he owned. And the county would remember for a generation that he had done it out of the goodness of his heart to a girl who had no business trying. Etta looked at him a moment, and then she looked down at the notepaper folded in her own brown hand, and then she did the thing that decided the next 60 days, which was that she folded it back into her coat and shook her head once, slow side to side. The way you tell a green horse no when yes would hurt it worse. "I thank you for standing at my father's grave," she said. "I'll not sell his gate off the back of it. I'll hold my own ground in my own honest use to the fall term, and I'll answer your complaint in open court with the truth of who cut what wire and whose fence it was standing on. And then I'll come home and pay my own note over my own counter." She turned to the room, and for the first time she let a little of it into her voice, not much, a hairline. "I came here asking no favor, and I'm leaving with none." But I'll ask you to remember, when it's told, that I stood in this door and said I'd hold it, and that Mr. Crane sat at that table and offered, so pleasant, to see that I couldn't." It was too fine a line for most of the room to feel the edge of, and Crane only smiled and inclined his head a courteous quarter of an inch, which meant the pleasantness was over. But Dorsey Pruitt felt it, and looked down at his own soft hands, and old Judge Amos Tolliver, who was at the county seat waiting on the fall term and had come to the meeting for the coffee and not the cattle, took his cigar out of his mouth and considered the small brown woman in the doorway with a new and unlaughing attention, and filed her away, the way a judge files a thing he suspects he will see again under oath. She walked out through the wagon yard where the stockman's hall kept its teams, and she did not let her hands shake until she was up on the seat of her own light wagon and out past the last building of the town, and by then it was only the heat. Cole used to say, "A horse reads your hands before it reads your voice." And a town is only a bigger horse that talks, and in the 2 years since the fire took him, the grass fire come roaring up out of the south in a dry wind while he was out on the open flats gathering strays past the wire, her father found afterward on the burned ground a mile below the long rail's first low-drift fence with his ruined horse, and the country calling it the stubborn old fool's own doing for ranging past a fence like it was still the old open country. Though Cole Calder had read weather and fire better than any man on the flats, and had gone out that day into a wind he would never have crossed if a new strung company fence had not turned his line of retreat into a trap. In those 2 years Etta Calder had given the country nothing off her hands at all. Not at the burying. Not through 2 dry springs. Not when the bank turned the note over in her fingers like a thing already spoiled. She had held a deeded gap, and a string of good honest home caught horses together with her own 2 hands, and whatever wage she could scrape. And she had heard herself called the Calder girl in the voice men use for a gate that hangs crooked, and she had learned exactly one lesson from all of it, which was Cole's lesson, and it was this: you never own a thing you have to fence, and the day a country forgets it, the country belongs to whoever owns the most wire. She said it to herself now, out loud on the hot seat, the way she said it most days, and then she gathered the lines and clucked to the team and drove the long miles home to the rafter sea, under a sky the color of scorched tin, the new fence running with her the whole way on her right hand, mile on taut mile of the long rail's bright wire, where 2 summers back there had been nothing but grass to. The butte and the wind walking in it. The last 2 miles the road climbed to the home rise and ran along the pole fence of her own horse pasture, the old honest peeled post fence her father had built low and wide so a horse could see it, and never a strand of wire in it, and beyond the poles in the last of the light the horse stock stood dark and gathered at the spring. Good honest using horses every one, and standing off from them, alone, at the far corner of the fence where he always stood, because a stud stands his own watch, the one horse the whole country had told her was not worth the grass he ate. Slate was a stallion, 7 years old that summer, the deep smoky blue-gray of a rain cloud with the sun behind it. Black through the head and the legs and the long tail, roaned all over the body with the fine mist of white hairs through the dark, that the country reads at a glance, and prices at a glance, near 17 hands and heavy through it, with a broad, plain, honest head, and a thick neck and legs like porch posts. And there was nothing fine drawn or blooded looking about him from any side at all. He was a using horse to look at, a working horse, the kind of coarse, deep-built animal a freighter's hitch would not shame, and the country, which prized a slim, fast-blooded horse above nearly anything a man could own, and measured a horse's worth by the daylight it could show in a quarter-mile dash, and the manners it showed at a fence, had looked at that big, plain blue stud exactly once, years back, and decided everything it intended to decide about him. Outlaw, they called him. A blue brute. An ugly, ruined-colored scrub with a roan soft hide and a spoiled disposition. a horse that fought the wire and would not lead quiet past it, that had gone through 3 fences in his first season under saddle and cut himself to ribbons doing it, a horse no sensible man could use in a country going over to wire, fit only to be caught and sold cheap to the cannery buyers and be done. The truth of it, which no one but Cole had ever troubled to learn, was the whole opposite, and it was written in the one book the fine horsemen never read, which was the Book of the Fire and the Long Dark Mile. Cole Calder had caught that stud wild off the brakes as a 2-year-old, out of the last band of open country mustangs the wire had not yet penned, and had seen in one look what the rest of the country would not see in 7 years, that the horse did not fear the fence because he feared nothing, that a heart with no quit in it will go through a wall and count the cost after, and that the same nerve the country called Outlaw was the one nerve on the whole flats that would carry a rider into fire and wire and smoke where a fine biddable horse would set its feet and scream. Cole had gentled him not by breaking that nerve, but by keeping faith with it, slow, over years, until the big blue stud would do anything under heaven that Cole Calder's hands asked of him, and would still, to the end of his life, refuse to be driven, penned, or fenced by any hand that had not first earned him. And Cole was gone before the country ever had cause to see what the horse was, and Etta had kept the stud through 2 dry springs when $1 was $1, and could not have told the bank or the meeting or her own tired self exactly why, except that when she stood at that fence in the worst of the dark, broke and alone and 40 miles from a friend, the big blue stud would come the length of the pasture to her without being called and lower that great plain ugly head and breathe warm against her shoulder, and he was the only thing in the Chalk Flats country that had never once, not one time, laughed. They had come for him twice. The men who buy cheap coarse horseflesh for the cannery and the freight hitch, $1 cash for the big Outlaw. Take him off your feed bill, and both times Cole had run them off the place, and both times he had said the same thing to Etta after, standing at this same fence. They see the wire cuts on his chest, and they think they're looking at a spoiled horse. They're looking at the only horse in this country too free to be fooled by a fence. Girl, there's coming a day this whole basin is wired to the sky, and the wire will hold every soft, biddable thing in it. And on that day, the one heart that never learned to respect a fence is going to be worth more than all their blood put together. Cole had believed it the way he believed in weather, and had spent his last years quietly proving the horse on the long circles and the bad nights, and had gone out into the fire before the country ever had cause to see it, and Etta had kept the stud and could not have said why, except that a woman who has been priced cheap by a whole country her whole life knows another such creature when she stands at a fence beside him in the dark. A horse outfit and a guarded gap the size of the Rafter Sea want a crew, a couple of top hands, and a wrangler and men to ride the line and hold the gate through the shipping season, and Etta had spent the dry summer quietly making her arrangements the way Cole had taught her, a word here, a handshake there, so that when she drove into her own yard the morning after the meeting to hold her outfit together for the fall works, she believed she had 2 riders promised and her hands set, and she found out inside of an hour that she had almost none. She found it out the way you find out most things in a stock town, in pieces, off men who would not meet her eye. Gil Sowerby, who had ridden 2 seasons for Cole, had taken on with the long rail for the fall gather at $40 a month, which was 10 over the wage and about 20 more than the work was worth. The 2 Deaver boys, who she had counted on for the line riding, had been told by somebody they respected that a horse outfit bossed by an unwed girl on a range the company meant to have was a good way to work all fall for a wage the bank would eat, and had reconsidered. One by one, all that week, at the mercantile and the blacksmith's and on the church step, her crew came apart in her hands, and not one man of them had been threatened, not out loud, because Sewell Crane did not threaten. He hired, he suggested, he let it be understood. And by the following Saturday, the word had gone all up and down the chalk flats that riding for the Calder girl was a thing a sensible man did not do. And the Calder girl had, by her own count, 3 people left in the whole country who had not been bought away or scared off. An old stove-up mustanger past 60 who had first caught her horse wild. A black stockman, no white outfit on the flats, would pay a fair wage, and a blamed, half-broken fence and well-man the whole basin spat at as the hand that had strung the company's wire. Ezra Bishop was the stockman, and he was the best one in the territory, and he could not draw a top-hand's pay anywhere on the chalk flats, for the one reason that had nothing to do with his hands. He was a quiet, deliberate, deep-chested man of about 45 who had come up the trail from Texas after the war and stayed, and he had forgotten more about a horse and a rope and dry country stock than the Deaver boys would ever learn. And Cole had hired him at the same wage as any white man on the place, and, as Ezra told it, never once made a speech about it. He was in the saddle shed working a rawhide riata when Etta came in out of the heat that Saturday, and he did not look up from the braiding, and he said before she could open her mouth, I heard, "You come to tell me to take a long rail wage before the door shut. I'll save you the trouble. I'm not going." He set the riata down and looked at her then, level and dark. "Your daddy paid me like a man for 11 years. I don't know how to be worth less than that all of a sudden just because he's gone. I'll stay for the $1 a day, and I'll stay for nothing if it comes to that. And I'll tell you the one true thing nobody at that meeting told you, which is that you've got one horse on this place with the heart to carry you clear across this country through anything the company can set in your road, and the country told you. He's an outlaw." He picked the riata back up. "So, where do you want to start?" Etta Calder stood in the warm leather smell with the dust of the road still on her, and she came nearer to weeping at that plain speech than she had come at the burying, and she did not, because that was a rule she had. "We start," she said, "by hiring the people the country threw away. They're the only ones left whose wages Crane never troubled to buy, and the only ones who know what it costs to be judged by the one thing about you nobody bothered to look past." Ezra nodded slow, as though she had finally said a sensible thing. "Then you best go see Harmon Teal first," he said, "and get the worst of it behind you. Everybody else will be easier after." Old Pap Doss she did not have to hire, because Pap Doss had hired himself the day her father was buried and had never once discussed the matter since. He was a bandy, sun-cured old mustanger past 60, too stove-up in the hips to fork a horse any longer, who had run the wild bands off the brakes for 30 years back, when the brakes still had wild bands to run. And it was Pap Doss who had caught the blue stud as a 2-year-old in a box canyon in a driving spring rain, and sold him to Cole Calder for $1 and a jug, and had told Cole to his face he was a fool to pay even that for a roan that would only break his heart and every fence he owned. Pap Doss had been wrong about exactly one horse in his life, and he knew which one it was. And he had spent the years since making it up to the animal in the only coin he had, which was to drive out to the Rafter Sea on his old spring wagon, and sit at the pole fence in the evenings, and tell the blue stud, at length and profanely, what a worthless outlaw he was, while the horse cropped grass, and paid him no mind at all. He caught that horse wild, and he priced him at $1, and he's never forgiven himself the once, Cole used to say, which is why he'll be sitting at that fence talking to him the day they carry us both off. Girl, there's a kind of love that can only speak in insults, and old Doss has got it bad. She went to Harmon Teal last in her own mind, which is to say she had thought of him first the night her crew fell apart, and had spent a week finding reasons not to, because going to Harmon Teal meant riding into the yard of the man the country said had fenced them all in, and asking him to ride for her. That was the whole cruel shape of it, and she did not pretend to herself it was any other shape. Harmon Teal had been the finest fence and well man in the country before the long rail ever rolled a spool of wire off a wagon, a man who could sink a post plumb in Calais and stretch a wire true across a mile of broken ground and witch a well where 3 other men had come up dry. And when the Meridian Company came in with its Eastern money and its miles of new barbed wire and no local man who knew the ground, it was Harmon Teal they hired to boss the stringing of the first fences, because he was the best, and he took the work because a man takes work. He had strung the company's wire for the better part of a year, honest and true, and plumb, the finest fence on the flats. Before the day he set a corner by the government marker and read his own field notes twice and understood that the line he was building ran a full half-mile out onto the open public range the company had no more right to fence than to fence the sky, and that the tidy improvement he had been so proud of the trueness of was a theft, and that he had been the hand that built it. He had walked off the job that hour and never gone back, and the country, which does not trouble itself with where a line runs, only with who got fenced out by it, had decided that Harmon Teal was the man who fenced the chalk flats and had spat him out. He had drifted about as far down as a man drifts and still gets up in the morning, doctoring windmills and mending gear for meals, half the time in a bottle, and had never once stood up in a saloon and told the true shape of it, because a man who has built the thing that chokes his neighbors does not get to plead the fine points of the survey to them, and Harmon Teal knew it better than any of them. She found him in the shade of a lean to up a dry draw, mending a windmill vane with his coat off and his gray-shot hair in his eyes, and he straightened when she rode into the yard on the big blue stud and stood holding a pair of fence pliers and looked at her without surprise, as though he had been expecting her for a week, which perhaps he had. Mr. Teal. She stayed up on Slate, because a thing like this is easier said from a horse. I've a gap to hold over the fall and a fence-cutting complaint to answer at the term, and a note that eats my outfit if I lose. Crane's bought off or scared off every rider in the country. I've a stockman, a stove-up mustanger, and no fence man, and no second hand. I'm told you were the finest hand with a post and a wire and a well that ever came into this country before they hung the company's fence around your neck, and I'm told most of what they hung there was a lie. He was quiet a moment, and then he set the pliers down on the bench, careful, and said the thing she had come there braced to hear him not say. It wasn't a lie that I strung that fence, Miss Calder. Whatever else. His voice was low and even, and it cost him. I bossed the crew that rolled the long rail's wire across the flats. I set the posts myself, plumb and true, the best fence this country ever saw, and I was proud of the trueness of it, right up to the morning I read my own notes and understood what I'd built. Half a mile out onto ground that belonged to every man in this basin, and to no man, wire I had no right to sink a single post of. I built the thing that's choking you and everybody like you. So before you say another word, you best hear me say that one, because I'll not take a wage off Cole Calder's girl under any softer accounting than the true one. I strung the wire. The country's fenced. That's the fact the rest has got to be built on or not at all. Etta Calder looked at him a long moment from the back of the scorned horse, 2 of the country's guilty verdicts sitting there in the hot yard, looking at each other, and then she said the thing she had ridden a week's worth of nerve to say. My father caught a horse this whole country swears is a worthless outlaw, because he took the trouble to see the one thing about him they were all too proud to look for. I've had 2 years to learn that a country'll blame the nearest hand when a rich man wants a thing blamed. It blamed the horse. It blamed you. It blamed my father for ranging past a fence that shouldn't have been there. She let that sit. You strung a true fence where a company told you the line ran, and the day you learned the line was a lie you walked off and never went back and never once defended yourself, because you'd rather carry the whole blame than plead a survey to men who'd been fenced out. I don't know yet how to prove where that wire really runs. But I think, Harmon Teal, that you know to the inch where every post of it stands, and which of them stand on ground that was never the company's to fence, and I think under everything you've been carrying the one true map of this whole robbery in your head for 2 years and calling it your sin. I'm not offering you a wage I can pay yet. I'm offering you the one thing Crane can't, which is a chance to be in the yard the day it comes out where that fence really stands. I'd be obliged if you'd come fenceman and second for me." He was still a long moment, looking not at her, but at the big blue horse she sat, at the plain, honest head, and the deep-scarred chest, and the quiet eye, and something in his own worn face moved. "That the Roan," he said. It was not a question, the one they all say Cole wasted his feet on. "The outlaw, the same. Slate, I strung the fence he cut himself to ribbons going through, his first year." Harmon Teal looked at the old faint seams along the horse's chest, the white hairs grown in over them where the wire had opened him, and his mouth twisted with something that was not quite a smile. Whole country pointed at those scars and called him spoiled. I never told a soul what I thought when I first saw them, because who'd have listened to the man that built the fence? He picked up the pliers again and turned them over in his scarred hands. "What I thought was, there's a horse that looked at a thing made to stop him, and did not for one instant believe it could. I patched that fence a dozen times his first summer, and I never once got the better of him. He'd walk it, quiet as you please, feeling for the give, and where there was give he'd go through it and take the hide off his chest and never break stride, like the pain was just the toll, and he'd already decided to pay it." He looked up at her. "A man builds fence for a living, Miss Calder. He learns to hate a horse like that. And then one morning he learns what the fence really is, and he understands he had it backwards the whole time, and the horse was the only honest thing on the job. He set the pliers in his belt. Unsaddle him and put him in the shade. I'll get my kit. You're going to want to hear where that line runs before you say another word to anybody with a badge." That was the whole of it. There was no handshake, and there did not need to be. Etta Calder had ridden out that morning with a stockman, a stove-up old man, and a scorned horse, and she rode home in the evening with a fenceman who knew to the inch where the robbery stood. And the four of them and the outlaw made, by the county's reckoning, the sorriest outfit ever gathered on the chalk flats, and by Etta's own reckoning the only honest one left in it. That night the three of them sat at her father's table, under the one lamp, Ezra Bishop and Harmon Teal, and old Papdoss come up from his wagon. And Harmon spread a sheet of butcher paper and drew from memory the whole of the long rails fence, every mile of it, and where he came to the stretch that closed off Calder Gap he set his blunt finger down and held it there. "The company's wire runs here," he said, "along the section line, lawful enough, till it comes to the gap. And then it does a thing no honest fence does. It jogs. Half a mile out into the open ground, around the outside of your gap, to close it off from the free range, and back again. That jog is the whole game. It fences the one gate of this basin shut, on public land, so every outfit on the flats has got to come to the company hat in hand to move a herd, or come to you, and you they mean to have in prison by then. Cut that jog, and you've opened the range back up and made a felon out of yourself in the same stroke, which is exactly the choice they've built for you." He looked around the lamp. "Which is why we are not going to cut one strand of it. We are going to prove it should never have been strung." They rode the line for it in the cool of the next 3 mornings, Etta on the blue stud, and Harmon on a company broke bay he had kept, following the jog of the wire out across the open ground where it had no business being, and on the 3rd morning Harmon got down off the bay in a patch of buffalo grass a good half-mile out from Calder Gap, and went down on his knees and brushed the dirt away from him, a thing Etta would have ridden past all her life without seeing. It was a squat post of native stone, gray and lichened and old, set flush and deliberate, with a cross and a set of marks cut into its weathered top by a chisel a long time back. "Government corner," Harmon said, and there was something like reverence in his low voice. "Section marker. The land office set these when they ran the first lines through here, before your daddy ever proved up. This one's a witness corner. It fixes the line between the open public sections and the deeded ground." He looked up at her, and his worn face had come alive. "The company's wire is strung a full quarter-mile out past this stone, Miss Calder. On the open public section. There is not a court in the territory, nor a land office in Washington, that can call that a lawful fence, because a man cannot fence the public domain and charge his neighbor for the gate. Your daddy knew these stones. He drove his own corner post off this one when he proved up, dated and witnessed, and it'll be of record in the land office to this day." He stood, slow, his knees cracking. "They didn't just fence you in. They fenced the whole United States government in, and they were fool enough or bold enough to think nobody left in this country could read a stone. It changed the shape of everything, that gray stone in the grass, though Etta was careful not to let it change her face. It meant the fight was not, at bottom, a fight she could lose by grit, alone against money. It was a fact, fixed and dated and of record, older than the company and older than the wire, and no amount of Eastern money could move a section corner a government surveyor had set. It meant that the fence she stood, charged with cutting, was itself the crime, and that the true remedy was not to touch the wire at all, but to bring a man with the authority to read that stone and the field notes behind it out onto this ground before the fall term, and let the law see what the law had already written. Harmon knew the man for it. A deputy United States land agent named Purnell Vane. Dry and spectacled and incorruptible because he had already been offered everything a land agent can be offered and had wanted none of it, who rode the territory looking into exactly the kind of unlawful enclosure the long rail had strung, and who could be brought if a body wrote the right letter to the right office and the letter reached him before the term, to walk this line with his own chain and his own field book and swear to what the stone said. That was the whole of the plan, laid out at the lamp that night, and it was a good plan, and it depended on two things that the next 6 weeks would put to every test the company could devise, on the letter reaching Vane and Vane reaching the flats before the fall term, and on Etta Calder keeping her outfit, her gap, and her own neck out of prison long enough for a slow, honest government to arrive. Because the company did not mean to give her 6 quiet weeks, and Etta had known it would not from the hour she shook her head at that long table. The pressure came the way Sewell Crane did everything, without a raised voice and without a fingerprint on it. And it came through his fence boss, a man named Jute Ammons, who was to Crane's smooth, pleasant front what the wire is to the post. Ammons was a lean, sallow, soft-spoken man of about 40 up, out of nobody knew where, who ran the Long Rail's fence crews and its night work both, and who carried a pair of good fence pliers and a coil of smooth wire and a wire stretcher on his saddle the way another man carries a watch chain, always coiling or working something in his quiet hands. He had no history a man could find and no temper a man could provoke, and he did the work an outfit does not name. A cut fence here, a strayed herd there, a fouled water, a fire that got away in a dry wind, and he did it so clean that the country had long ago stopped looking for the hand behind its troubles and simply called them the weather of living next to the long rail. The first of it was the lane gate. Cole Calder had always kept a wide swing gate at the mouth of the gap, hung honest on the pole fence so that the neighbors' herds could pass through to the railhead for a fair toll or for nothing in a hard year, because that was how the open country had always worked, and Cole had gone on working it after the wire came. Etta came down to the gap one morning to find the company had thrown a new fence of its own bright wire clean across the mouth of the lane the night before, tying its illegal jog shut, and hung in it a heavy new lane gate of iron and wire, and chained the gate, and snapped a padlock through the chain. Not one hoof could pass the gap now without the company's key. It was a small thing, and it was the whole war in miniature. A country that had moved its stock through Calder Gap for a generation was shut out of it in a night, and the shutting looked, to any man who rode by, exactly like a fence, lawful, permanent, and hers to have prevented, if only she had sold when she was asked. Etta did not touch the lock. She sat the blue stud and looked at it a long while, the chain and the new bright padlock winking in the early sun on a gate across ground the gray stone said was not the company's at all, and then she rode home, and wrote it all down. Plain, in her own hand. The date, the gate, the lock, the strand count of the new wire, and folded the paper away. Because a woman who has been called a liar by a whole country learns early to keep the kind of record that does not care whose word it is against. Then, the spring. The Rafter Sea horse stock, watered at a good live spring below the home rise, the one dependable water in a dry mile, and Etta came up to it one hot noon to find it fouled, a barrel of something poured into the head of it, the water gone milky and bitter, and the stock standing off from it with their thirst on them, and would not drink. Ezra read the ground around the spring for a long time, and said nothing a lady needed to hear, and a good deal she needed to know. And what the sign said was one shod horse, come and gone in the night by way of the breaks, and no barrel left behind to swear to. There was no court in it, and no proof in it, only a fouled spring and a hard week of hauling water in the wagon from the far tank, while the country, when it heard, mostly agreed that it was a shame, but that a woman alone really could not expect to keep water clean in a dry year. Could she? And had she thought any more about Mr. Crane's generous offer? Old Pap Doss drove his water in his spring wagon every day of that week, without being asked, cursing the whole way, and dared any long rail rider he passed to say a word about it, and none of them did, because there is a kind of stove-up old man that even a hired hard case would rather not find out about. The trespass came next, and it was the cleverest of the small cruelties, because it turned her own honest stock into a weapon against her. A stretch of the company's wire along the river pasture was found cut one morning, 3 strands parted clean and low, the way a careful man parts wire he means to blame on somebody else, and through the gap a good part of the Rafter Sea cattle had drifted overnight onto long rail grass. Drawn by the green along the water, the way any thirsty stock will drift toward feed and water through an open fence. The company gathered them before noon, every head, and drove them to its home corrals, and impounded them, and sent a rider to town the same afternoon to swear out 2 things at once before the county: a bill for the trespass and the damage to the grass, and a complaint. Sworn and particular, that Etta Calder had willfully and feloniously cut the fence of the Meridian Land and Cattle Company for the purpose of grazing her stock upon the company's range, which under the new territorial statute the stockmen's own association had lobbied through against the fence-cutting troubles, was not a trespass at all, but a felony, punishable by a term in the territorial prison. It was laid so that the same act condemned her twice. If she paid the trespass bill to get her starving stock back, she all but confessed the cattle had been hers to keep off the grass, and if she did not, the company held her herd and her shipping money hostage against the term. And either way the sworn complaint stood, with her father's own name on the pliers they had left, bright and new oiled, lying in the cut grass by the parted wire for the deputy to find. Because that was the last turn of it, and it was the turn that told Etta at last the true and whole shape of the thing she was in. The pliers laid by the cut fence were not the company's. They were her father's, Cole Calder's old fencing pliers, worn smooth at the jaw. that had hung on their nail in the rafter C saddle shed since the burying, and that Etta could have sworn were hanging there still, until she went to the nail that evening and found it empty. Someone had come onto her place in the night, taken her father's own tool off its nail, and laid it in the grass by a fence they had cut themselves, so that when the law came, it would find the Calder pliers at the Calder cut and want no further proof. And standing in the empty nailed dusk of the saddle shed, with that understanding coming up cold through her, Etta Calder finally saw the machine entire, the way you see the hole of a trap, only once your foot is in it. Crane had never meant only to dry her out or wear her down or buy her cheap. He had built, patient and pleasant, over a whole summer, a machine with exactly one purpose: to put an unwed girl in the territorial prison for a felony she never did, so that a note the company had bought would fall due on an outfit with no one left to answer it, and the deeded quarter and the gap and the gate of the whole basin would drop into the long rails hand clean and lawful and grieved over, while the county shook its head and said what a pity, and how she'd been warned. The cut fence was not the crime the company feared. The cut fence was the company's own work, the bait and the frame both, cut by the same hand that had strung it, because a felony conviction was worth more to them than any fence, and the surest way to hang a fence cutting on a woman was to cut the fence yourself and leave her father's pliers in the grass. "They want it cut," she said to the three of them at the lamp that night, turning her father's cold pliers over in her hands, and her voice was very quiet and very level, which the men who knew her had learned to be more wary of than another woman's shouting. "Every strand of that jog they strung, they want me to take a wire cutter to it. So bad they cut it themselves, and signed my name to the cut. Which means the one thing they never once counted on is that we don't touch it. Not a strand. We let it stand, every foot of it, right where it's got no lawful right to be, and we bring a man out here who can read that stone, and we let the company's own wire stand up in open court and hang the company." She set the pliers down in the middle of the butcher paper map. Harmon writes the letter to Vane tonight. Ezra rides it to the railhead himself and puts it in a through mail sack with his own hands, because a letter to a land agent that goes by the long rail's own mail rider has got a way of never arriving. And from tonight on, one of us watches that fence around the clock, not to cut it, to swear that nobody did. The letter went the next morning, 60 rough miles to the railhead in Ezra Bishop's own saddlebag, and into the through sack under the agent's eye. And there was nothing to do after that but hold on, and watch a fence, and count the days off toward the fall term. And it was in that long holding stretch of late summer, with the grass curing to tinder in a dry, hot wind, and the whole flats holding its breath, that the youngest and least of the long rail's hands began, without anyone's leave, to lose his stomach for the work. His name was Newt Farrow, and he was 19 going on 20, a thin, fair, open-faced young fellow all wrists and cowlick, who had been on his own in the world since he was hardly more than a boy. Orphaned young off a busted emigrant wagon, and taken on by the long rail as a stock tender and fence hand, for the one plain reason that it was the only wage in the country, and a young man alone has got to eat. He had strung wire and dug post holes and held horses, and done, at first, whatever the fence boss told him, the way a green hand does, without leave to ask why. And he had told himself for a good while that fences were only fences, and none of the rest of it was his affair. But Newt Farrow had been made to hold the horses the night 3 men rode out and cut the company's own wire by the river pasture, and he had watched from the dark while one of them walked into the rafter C's saddle shed bold as noon and came back out with an old worn pair of pliers, and he had helped drive a starving woman's cattle to the company corrals in the gray morning after. And something in the boy that his hard young life had not yet managed to kill had turned over in him and would not turn back. He was too green and too frightened and too alone to do anything about it for a good many days, but carry it, sick, behind his open young face, and go on stringing wire with his hands while the thing worked in him. But he had begun. Quietly, to watch the smooth, pleasant man he worked for the way you watch a thing you have started to be afraid of, and to notice which nights Jude Ammons and his 2 hard cases rode out without the crew, and to hold, unspoken, in his thin chest, the one piece of knowledge that would come to matter more than anything the fence boss ever taught him. Where, in the Long Rail's headquarters, the company kept the spool. The word that Purnell Vane was coming reached the Rafter Sea and the Long Rail within the same 2 days, the way such word does, and it changed the tempo of everything. A short dry letter came back to Harmon at last, forwarded twice. In the deputy land agent's own cramped hand, he had the complaint of unlawful enclosure. He found it grave. He would be at the county seat for the opening of the fall term, to walk the line himself and read the corners, and he counseled the parties to disturb nothing on the ground in the meanwhile. It was everything Etta had prayed for, a slow, honest government finally turning its head their way, and she understood the moment she read it that it was also the most dangerous news she could have received, because Sewell Crane read the same weather she did. Crane now had a matter of days, not weeks, to finish his business, to break the Rafter Sea past any government saving, to turn her herd and her shipping money and her nerve to ruin, and above all to make the last seen picture of Etta Calder, on the eve of the term, the picture of a desperate, cornered woman capable of anything, before a spectacled man with a chain and a field book could arrive and read a stone that did not care about Eastern money at all. So Etta gathered her cattle. It was the sensible thing and the only thing, with shipping near and the fence cut and her stock drifting into trap after trap. She and Ezra and Harmon and even old Papdos on his wagon threw the whole of the Rafter Sea together over 3 hard days, near 300 head, and held them bunched on the good cured grass of the home flat between the rise and the gap, close under her own eye, where nothing could scatter them onto the company's wire in the dark. It was the right move, and Crane had counted on her making it, because a bunched herd on a dry flat in a hot south wind is not only easy to watch, it is easy to burn. The fire came in the black of a windy night, and it came, like everything Jude Ammons did, from exactly the right place. It started away to the south, up the wind, out on the open grass past the last of the company's own fence, so that when the first red line of it lifted over the roll of the land and the first hot breath of smoke came down on the wind, it was already a mile wide and running. A low wall of flame walking north through cured grass tall enough to carry it, straight down on the bedded herd and the home flat and the gap beyond. Etta was out of the house and up on the blue stud bareback with a rope halter before she had rightly waked, the whole southern sky gone a sick pulsing orange, and the cattle already up off the bed ground and turning, and she knew in one look the thing every stock raiser dreads worse than any flood, that 300 head with fire on their tails will run before it. Blind and gathering and unstoppable, straight downwind, and that downwind, across the whole mouth of the home flat, ran the Long Rail's bright new illegal fence, 4 taut strands of barbed wire on close-set posts, and beyond it the narrow gap, and that the fire was not merely burning her out. It was driving her entire herd, at a headlong run in the dark, onto a wall of wire. That was the trap, whole and perfect, and it was the oldest trap on the plains dressed in the newest wire. Before the country was fenced, a fire like this one was a terror, but not a slaughter, because the stock ran before it across open ground until the fire guttered out in a burn or a break or a change of wind, and lived. It was the wire that changed the arithmetic. A running herd hits a barbed fence in the dark, and the front rank goes into it and cannot go through, and the ranks behind pile onto the front, and the wire holds them there packed and screaming against the strands with the fire coming on, and the fence that accompanies strings to hold cattle out holds them into the flame instead. And that was what Sewell Crane had bought, and Jute Ammons had built and lit, a fire that would pile the whole rafter sea onto the company's own wire, and char it there, and be called, in the morning, a dry year accident and a careless woman's ruin, with maybe a whisper that she'd set it herself, cornered as she was, and cut her own fence trying to save them. And it would have worked, every part of it, but for the one thing in the whole country that had never in its life believed a fence could stop it. The fine horses would not face it. Ezra's good bay and Harmon's company broke horse, and every using horse in the pasture wheeled and fought their riders, and would not be driven toward that oncoming wall of fire and smoke. And no horseman living could have made them, because a sane horse fears fire the way it fears nothing else on earth, and these were sane, well-broke, biddable horses, and biddable was exactly what they had been bred and gentled to be. But Etta Calder was not on a biddable horse. She was on the Outlaw, the blue brute that had gone through 3 fences in his first year, because he had never once believed a fence was real. The horse the whole country had priced at $1 and told her to send to the cannery, and when she turned his ugly head into the smoke and asked him, with her hands and her seat and her low voice, to do the one insane thing, the blue stud gathered himself under her and went straight into it toward the fire and the wire, ears pinned and nostrils wide and not one instant of quit in him, because the same heart that would not respect a fence would not respect a fire either, and the toll was just the toll, and he had already decided to pay it. What she did then the chalk flats argued over for 40 years and never once got right, because there was no one to see it but Ezra Bishop holding the panicked horses at the rise, and Harmon Teal afoot at the gap with a wire cutter, and neither of them ever told it the same way twice for the size of it. She ran the blue stud down the inside of that fence line ahead of the herd, in the dark, with the fire's light throwing the shadows of the posts 30 feet long across the grass, and the heat coming on her like a wall, and where the strung wire met the mouth of the gap she put him at it, at the fence itself, the way he had gone at fences all his outlaw life, and the big horse hit the top strands with his scarred chest and his whole 17 hands of driving weight behind them. And the posts Harmon Teal had once set so plumb and true came up out of the dry ground one after another, and the wire that had held a whole country went down under the Outlaw and lay flat, and the gap stood open. Harmon was already cutting at the far post, and Ezra came down off the rise the moment the fine horses felt the gap open behind them and would move, and between the 3 of them and the one blue horse they turned the leaders of that blind stampede in the last 100 yards, off the closing wall of the fire-lit fence and through the black open mouth of Calder Gap. And the whole 300 head poured through it after their leaders, and out onto the burned safe ground beyond, and were saved, every one that the fire had not already taken at the edges, thundering out into the dark and the dust, while the grass fire ran up against the flattened wire behind them, and found nothing left to pile a herd against, and guttered, and burned itself out along the wet spring seep, and quit. It cost them. It could not have cost nothing. The fire took a dozen head at the trailing edge before the gap came open, lost in the smoke and the crush, and Etta made herself count them in the gray morning, and write the number down like all the rest. Harmon Teal had gone down under the turning herd when the leaders swung and had a broken arm and 3 cracked ribs and a boot heel torn away, and lay propped white faced against a gap post with Pap Doss cursing over him and binding him. And the blue stud, the outlaw, the horse nobody wanted, stood in the first gray light at the mouth of the gap, with his sides heaving and his black legs planted, and a long, ragged wire tear opened the length of his scarred chest, the new cut laid raw and bright across the old white seams of the fences of his youth, breathing slow and steady, and not favoring it at all. As though the whole night had been no more than the toll on a road he had always known he would one day be asked to travel. Etta got down off him there in the burned grass and put her forehead against his ugly plain jaw and stood a long moment while the smoke lifted off the flats. And then she straightened, because there was a torn horse to stitch and a hurt man to move and a herd to gather, and she already knew a far worse fight than the fire coming with the daylight, and Cole Calder's girl did not have the luxury of coming apart before any of it was done. She stitched the stud herself in the full light of that morning, kneeling in the burned grass with a curved needle and waxed thread, while Ezra held the halter and the big horse stood head low and took it without a flinch. And as she drew the long tear closed over his heart, she said to him, "Lo," the thing she could not say to any person, "they'll call this your ruin too. They'll say the outlaw wrecked the fence and near got the whole herd burnt, and they'll never once say you're the only reason there's a herd at all." She tied off the thread. "But I saw it, and there's a man coming who reads the ground, and before this is done the whole country is going to have to look at what it priced at $1 and know what it was looking at." The horse blew out a long breath against her arm, and beyond the gap the last smoke of the company's fire lay flat and gray over the burned flats, and Etta Calder knelt in it and finished her stitching, and did not yet know that Sewell Crane had already sent a rider hard for the county seat in the night to swear, before she could reach it herself, that the desperate Calder woman had fired the range and cut the company's fence with her own hands, and near burned out half the basin doing it. He came in the last of that same long day, the young hand, Newt Farrow, riding a broke-down company horse up the wagon track to the Rafters Sea in the open, in daylight, which was either the bravest or the greenest thing a long rail man could have done, and which turned out to be both. He got down at the gate white and shaking, and would not come in past the yard, and he stood there with his hat in his two hands, and told the whole of it out into the burned evening air in a rush, the way a boy confesses a thing he has carried past his strength to carry. He told her the fire was set, and by whose hand, and that he had held the horses for the cut fence, and watched a man walk into her shed for her father's pliers. He told her the company had sworn a new complaint that very morning at the county seat, wired ahead on the long rail's own line to the deputy at the term, that Etta Calder, cornered and desperate, had fired the open range herself and cut the company's fence to save her trespassing stock and near burned out half the basin in her recklessness, and that there were 3 long rail hands already riding for town to swear they had seen her at it by the fire's own light. And he told her, last and lowest, the thing he had been carrying behind his open young face for a month, that in the harness room at the long rail headquarters, under a tarp behind the feed, the company kept the great master spool of its wire, the bright new patented barbed make that no other outfit in the territory had yet strung, the same wire to the barb and the twist as the strands cut by the river, and the strands of the trap fence at the gap, and that in the office desk, folded in the company's own field book, was the fence crew's original survey of the line, the one Harmon Teal had read 2 years back, with the jog around Calder Gap drawn in and the public section marked plain, in the company's own hand, proving past any lawyer's wriggling that the long rail had known to the foot that it was fencing the public domain, and had done it anyway. "I'll swear to all of it," Newt Farrow said, and his young voice cracked on it and came steady. "In front of the judge, in front of Mr. Crane, in front of anybody. I know it'll come down on me too. I held the horses. But I can't watch them do to you what the wire did to your daddy and go on stringing fence like I never saw it. I just can't." He turned his hat in his hands. "Only they'll have you bound over and locked up before the land agent ever reads his stone, Miss Calder, if you ride into that town by the road. They've got the road watched and fresh horses staged the whole 60-mile, and they mean for the first anybody in that courthouse hears of you to be a deputy bringing you in for the fire. You've got to be there first. You've got to be there when the term opens, with the truth, before their story sets. It was full dark by the time they had it planned, and the plan was a simple and a terrible one. Because there was only one way to be 60 miles at the county seat by the opening of the term ahead of a company that held the road and the relay stations and the telegraph and every fresh horse between here and there. Etta could not go by the road. She would go across country, straight over the burned flats and down through the breaks and along the river in the dark. 60 miles of the worst going in the basin, smoke still smoldering in the draws, and the ground cut up with the company's fences and washed out at every crossing. The kind of ride that founders a fine horse in the first 10 miles and puts a careless one afoot in the dark, and she would go on the one horse in the country with the bottom and the nerve and the perfect contempt for a fence to do it. Ezra would carry Newt Farrow and a length of the company's own wire, cut from the flattened trap fence at the gap, where 300 witnesses' worth of hoof marks proved how it came down, by the wagon road behind her, slow and safe, to arrive after and swear. Harmon, splinted and bound and gray with pain, would not be moved and would not stop giving orders, and pressed into her hand before she rode the one thing he had carried out of his whole ruined trade, his own worn field book from the year he bossed the company's fence, with the true survey and the government corners set down in his own hand, dated, the map of the robbery he had called his sin for 2 years, and now, at last, got to call evidence. She rode at moonrise on the blue stud, with Harmon's field book buttoned inside her coat against her heart, and a coil of the company's bright wire tied to her saddle, and her father's cold pliers left behind on the table for the law to come and find where they belonged. And she put the ugly horse's head to the south and the burned country and let him go. What that ride was, no one who has not made one like it can be told. And Etta Calder herself remembered it after only in pieces, the smoldering smoke lying in the low draws, so that the horse walked her through it blind and unafraid where any other horse would have wheeled and quit. The black wire fences looming up out of the dark at a dozen crossings, and the blue stud never once checking or shying at a one of them, going over the low ones and, at the high tight ones the company had strung to turn a rider back, simply putting his scarred chest to them the way he had all his life, and taking them flat without breaking his long-reaching stride, the washed-out river ford in the pitch dark where he felt the bad footing and did not fight it but picked it, patient, one sure step at a time, and brought her up the far bank streaming, the long, long middle hours of the night on the open burned ground, where there was nothing to do but sit down in the saddle and trust the horse, and count, from 1, and ride. Somewhere in the small hours she passed, far off across the flat, the swinging lantern of one of the company's relay stations, and the shapes of fresh-staged horses standing saddled in the dark, waiting for a woman who would come by the road, and she went by them wide and silent on her Outlaw, and they never knew she had passed. And near dawn, back on the road at last, with the county seat's few lights coming up gray ahead, and the horse still under her, still reaching, still unspent after 60 miles of a night that would have set any fine horse in the territory afoot, or worse, she came up behind a thing that told her the whole of Sewell Crane's confidence, and the whole of his mistake at a single glance. 2 of the long rail's own fine-blooded horses, the pride of the company's string, standing blown and trembling and done at the roadside where their riders had ridden them into the ground, trying to make the town in the night by the road, and the men afoot beside them cursing, and neither horse fit to go another mile. The company had bet its whole hand on blood and speed and fresh relays down a watched road. It had never once thought to reckon with 60 miles of fire and fence and dark, and the one heart in the country that was bred for exactly that, and had been priced at $1 for the lack of any other thing. She rode the blue stud up the main street of the county seat, in the first true light of the morning the fall term opened, past the men just gathering on the courthouse steps who had laughed at her in the upper room of the Stockman's Hall 2 months before, and the sight of her stopped every one of them cold. The small brown woman in the burned and smoke-blacked coat, gray in the face and swaying a little in the saddle, on the heaving, wire-torn, ash-caked blue brute that stood in the street with its head up and its black legs planted, blown but not beaten, having done the thing no horse in the country was supposed to be able to do. She got down at the rail before the deputy could reach her, and she walked into that courtroom on her own 2 feet ahead of any man's hand on her arm. And she laid Harmonteel's field book and the coil of the company's bright wire on the clerk's table in front of the whole gathering term, and she said, in the low voice that carried, "My name is Etta Calder, and I am told there is a man in this county ready to swear I fired the range and cut a fence. I've ridden all night to be the first to answer it, and I'll answer it now, in the open, before I'm asked, because the truth of who cut what wire on this range is a thing this court can read with its own eyes, off the company's own spool, if it will hear me before it hears the men who've been paid to swear." Judge Amos Tolliver, on the bench not 10 minutes and holding his cold cigar, looked down at the woman he had filed away at the fence meeting for a thing he suspected he would see again under oath, and he did the thing that decided the rest, which was that he rapped his gavel once and said, dry as Calichet, "This court has been offered a great many sworn complaints about Miss Calder these 2 days, and has not yet been offered Miss Calder. It will hear her now. Sit down, deputy. Whatever she's charged with will keep the length of her say, and I've a mind to hear it." And into the room, before the company's lawyers could do more than come to their feet, walked a dry, spectacled, unhurried man in a travel-worn coat with a leather instrument case and a government field book under his arm. Purnell Vane, deputy of the United States Land Office, arrived on the morning stage to walk a line, and finding the line had come to him. What followed took the better part of 2 days, and the county talked of it for 40 years, but the spine of it could be read off 3 objects laid on a courthouse table, and Purnell Vane read them to the room in the flat, dry voice of a man who has never in his life had to raise it, because the facts do the work. He read the first from the great county plat and the land office records wired for and produced, that the government had run its lines and set its stone corners through the chalk flats a generation back, that Cole Calder had proved up his home section and driven his own dated, witnessed corner post off the government marker in the spring of 1871. All of record and none of it in dispute, and that the section line between the deeded ground and the open public domain lay exactly where the gray stone in the buffalo grass said it lay, a full quarter-mile inside the long rail's wire. He read the second off Harmonteel's own field book, opened and dated and sworn to by the gray, splinted man Ezra Bishop brought into the courtroom that afternoon. The fence crew's original survey, in the company's own employ, with the jog around Calder Gap drawn plain, and the public section marked, and the line the company knew it was crossing set down in a hand that could not now be unwritten. And he read the third, the plainest of all, off the coil of bright wire Etta, had carried 60 miles, and the strand the deputy was sent to cut from the flattened trap fence at the gap. That this new patented barbed make, this exact barb, and this exact twist was strung on no outfit in the territory but the long rail, came off no spool but the one under the tarp in the company's own harness room, and was one and the same wire as the strands cut by the river that the company had sworn against her, so that the fence Etta Calder stood, charged with cutting for gain, was proven, by its own manufacture, to have been cut by the only hand that had that wire to cut it with, which was the hand that strung it. The rest came down in pieces after that, the way a fence comes down once the corner post is pulled. Newt Farrow stood up, white and shaking and 19 years old, and told the court he had held the horses the night 3 long-rail men cut the company's own wire by the river and walked into the Calder shed for her father's pliers, and named the men and named the night, and told how the fire on the flats was set up the wind past the last company fence, a purpose to run the Calder herd onto the company's wire, and gave himself up to the court's mercy for the holding of the horses with a plainness that shamed every grown man in the room who had taken the company's wage and kept his eyes down. Old Pap Doss testified, profane and unshakable, to the flattened fence and the 300 head of hoof marks that had poured through the gap where the outlaw put the wire down, and to the plain fact that no woman with a wire cutter makes a gap a herd runs through, only a horse hitting it does, and dared the company's lawyer to go out and read the ground himself if he doubted an old man who had read ground for 60 years. Ezra Bishop swore to the fouled spring and the shod tracks and the impound. And the 3 long rail hands who had ridden to town to swear they saw Etta Calder at the fire by its own light were never called at all, because a lawyer who has watched the company's own wire and the company's own survey and the company's own boy hand the case to the other side does not put paid perjurers on the stand to be asked, under oath, exactly where they were standing and whose horses had foundered on the road. Sewell Crane sat through the whole of it smooth and pleasant to the last, and only when Judge Tolliver had heard it out did the pleasantness finally leave him, all at once, like water off a tin roof. The judge did not shout. He read his findings in a voice as dry as the land agent's. He found the Meridian Land and Cattle Company's fence around Calder Gap to be an unlawful enclosure of the open public domain of the United States, strung with knowledge and intent, and ordered it thrown down and the public range and the gap restored. He dismissed the fence-cutting complaint against Etta Calder as not merely unproven, but fabricated, and ordered the return of her impounded stock and the vacating of the trespass. He held her father's home section and his gate lawful, dated, and hers. And he bound Sewell Crane and the fence boss Jute Ammons over to the grand jury, the both of them, for the unlawful enclosure, for the firing of the open range, for the fouling of water, and for the subornation of false witness against her, and directed that the matter of a certain pair of pliers taken off her father's nail, and the whole shape of how a good stockman had come to be caught out by a company fence in a fire 2 summers back, be laid before the same grand jury for whatever it cared to find there. Jute Ammons was not in the courtroom to hear it. Ammons had read the weather off the blue horse standing blown and unbeaten at the courthouse rail the morning Etta rode in, the way a hard case reads the one sign that matters, and had been riding hard for the territory line since before the noon recess of the first day, and the chalk flats did not see him again. Sewell Crane was not ruined by Etta Calder. He was ruined, in the end, by the one arithmetic his money had never troubled to teach him, and it was his own. The eastern men of the Meridian Land and Cattle Company, who had never laid eyes on the chalk flats and cared nothing for the gap or the girl or the grass, read in their distant office the one word that closes an eastern purse faster than any other, unlawful, of record. Before the United States, and they did what absentee money always does at the first true smell of the law. They cut the man who had brought it down on them loose and clean, and were gone, and left Sewell Crane standing alone in a country that had watched him lose, holding a note on an outfit the court had just made worthless to him, and a name the grand jury was not done with. The country that had arranged itself around him like iron filings arranged itself, overnight, around the fact of his falling, and the same men who had nodded at his generous offer in the upper room found they had always had their doubts. He left the flats before the winter, quiet and pleasant to the last with no one left to be pleasant to, and the Wire King was a story the chalk flats told after. And told, like all the rest of it, mostly wrong. Etta Calder paid her own note that fall over her own counter at the bank, in cash, in front of whoever cared to watch, out of the shipping money the herd brought when Calder Gap stood open again, and the whole basin trailed its cattle through it to the cars, for a fair toll, or for nothing in a hard year, the way her father had always kept it. The long rail's wire came down off the public range that autumn by order of the court. Mile on mile of it rolled up and hauled away, and the grass came back up through the char of the fire the next spring the way grass does, green and careless, and not remembering. And the open ground was open again, held by right and not by the strongest hand. Ezra Bishop rode as foreman of the Rafter C from that fall on, at a top hand's wage and a hand in the profit, which was some 11 years overdue, and which neither of them ever made a speech about. Newt Farrow, cleared by his own honesty and the court's mercy, and with nowhere in the world to go, unrolled his bed in the Rafter C bunkhouse and stayed, and grew, over the years, into the kind of steady-grown man the frightened boy at the gate had always had it in him to be. Old Pap Doss went on driving out in his spring wagon to sit at the pole fence in the evenings and tell the blue stud, at length and profanely, exactly what a worthless, ugly outlaw he was. And the horse went on cropping grass and paying him no mind at all. And it was, Etta came to understand, the truest love in the whole country, the kind that can only speak in insults, and she was glad of it every evening it came up the road. Harmon Teal mended slow through that fall, his arm knitting crooked and his ribs long in the healing, and he did not leave, and neither of them spoke of it, until a still evening near the first snow, when Etta found him at the pole fence in the last light, looking at the blue stud where the horse stood his own watch at the far corner. The long new scar healed white now down his chest over the old white scars of his youth, one more line in a hide the whole country had read wrong. Harmon Teal was not a man of many words on his best day, and he had fewer than usual that evening, and what he finally said, without turning from the horse, was only, "I built the fence that fenced you in, Etta. I don't know that a man gets to stand at a woman's gate after a thing like that and ask to stay on the inside of it." He turned his hat once in his mended hands. "But I find I'd like to ask it, if you'd let me. That's the whole of my say. I'm not much for the rest of it." Etta Calder looked at him a long moment in the cold blue dusk, and then she looked at the ugly horse her father had believed in when no one else in the country would. The outlaw that had broken the wire and turned the fire and carried the truth 60 miles. The creature the whole world had thrown away for the one thing about it that turned out to be the only thing that mattered, and she thought that she had spent her whole life learning to see worth wear. The country saw ruin, and that it would be a poor kind of lesson if she could not see it now, standing at her own gate, in the shape of a blamed and mended man who had carried the true map of a robbery in his head for 2 years and called it his sin. "The gate's been open a while, Harmon," she said. "You're the last one on the flats to notice." And that was all of it, and there was no kiss at the gate, because that was not their way and never would be. There was only a mended man come in off the cold to a lit house, and a wedding the next spring in the reopened grass that the whole basin rode to. And a long life after that the story does not need to follow, because the country had already learned the only thing the story ever meant to teach it. And what it had learned, though it took the chalk flats a generation to say it plain, was the thing Cole Calder had known standing at that pole fence with his hand on the neck of a horse the world had priced at $1. He had said it to his daughter 100 times, and she said it now to herself in the evenings, at the same fence, with her own hand on the same scarred neck and the open grass running away gold to the butte where 2 years before there had been nothing but wire. You never own a thing you have to fence. Wire holds only what has no heart to test it, and when the fire comes it finds all the rest, every soft, biddable, well-bred thing that learned to respect a fence, and it is the open ground heart. The one they call an outlaw and price at $1 and tell you to send to the cannery, the one heart in the whole country too free to be fooled by a fence, that faces the wire and the fire and carries you through the smoke to the far side. The tidy fenced world will throw such a thing away every time, for its coarse bone and its ugly color and its refusal to be held, and every time. When the dry wind rises, and the wire draws tight, and the fire walks north in the dark, it will find it threw away the only thing it had that was ever going to save it. Cole Calder bred and caught and believed in that one heart, and did not live to see the country made to look at it. His daughter did. And on the open grass of the chalk flats, held by right and not by wire, the ugly blue outlaw the world threw away grew old and gray at the muzzle and free to the last, having been, when the one dark night finally asked it, worth more than all their blood together, which is the whole of what the dry country ever has to teach the green one, and the whole of why it takes a fire to teach it. Continuez.